Biden made his second major campaign speech since Friday, aiming to cast Republican frontrunner Donald Trump as a threat to democracy. Biden criticized what he believes is a white supremacist culture in the United States. Take a listen.
They're trying to determine to erase history and your future, banning books, denying your right to vote and have it counted, destroying diversity, equality, inclusion all across America, harboring hate and replacing hope with anger and resentment and dangerous view of America.
We are being joined by Nick Harper, our correspondent live from Washington, D.C. Nick, great to talk to you. It seems that polls are spelling concern for President Biden. He was talking at a majority Black church in South Carolina. He's losing Black voter support, according to the polls. Why is that?
Yeah, it's a particularly difficult time for the president as he eyes that re-election bid in November. Poll after poll suggesting that he's losing many of the key demographic that helped to get him elected in 2020. One of those are Black voters. Many of them say, quite simply, they feel disillusioned by him. They feel that he hasn't achieved many of the promises that he laid out during his campaigning 4 years ago. For example, things like reparations, trying to get money or benefits back to enslaved people, was something that he campaigned on, and yet there's been very little movement in Washington. They also say that they feel that they haven't benefited from the economy. President Biden says that he's done much to help the economy, even coining the term Bidenomics, saying that things have improved, inflation is coming down, and jobs have been created. But many voters out there, in particular Black voters, simply don't feel that. And that's why we've seen in the last few days really a change of message from President Biden, moving away from hammering how well he's done on the economy, instead hammering his likely rival in November's election, Donald Trump, naming him several times by name. That speech in Pennsylvania on Friday, also that speech on Monday in South Carolina, really attacking the former president, Donald Trump, saying that he would be a threat to democracy. He is trying very hard with Black voters. You may remember South Carolina was really the state that helped to propel him to get that Democratic nomination back in 2020. Before that, in many of these state votes in the primary and caucus season, he was trailing, often coming fourth or fifth. It wasn't until South Carolina, with that predominantly Black population, key voter bloc for President Biden, that we saw him winning the South Carolina in the early part of 2020, helping to propel him towards the nomination. So he's trying hard, but he is struggling according to the polls.
Yeah, and we saw himself sort of insert himself in the civil rights movement during that speech as well. Let's talk about the war in Gaza. A lot of voters, progressive-leaning, young voters, they're concerned about the Biden administration's handling and U.S. policy towards Israel and its support. Do you think that this foreign policy aspect might play a role in the 2024 presidential election?
Well, undoubtedly it will. I mean, this is another key voting bloc that Democrats are relying on to retain the White House in November. Those young voters, often left-leaning, progressive voters, many of them who are supportive of Palestinian rights and have been speaking out against what they see as human rights abuses carried out by Israel, not just over the last few months, but the settlement activity as well in the occupied territories for many decades. Now, President Biden knows that he needs to keep those young progressive voters on side, and yet polls once again showing that he's really struggling with those young voters who've been turned off by him, many of them saying that they simply cannot support him again in November's election because of how things have gone in the Israel-Hamas war. However, there's unlikely to be really any change from the Biden administration in its pro-Israel stance. I guess what we have seen, though, over recent weeks is really a push by Washington to try and get Israel to at least tone down their offensive. We've seen more pro-Palestinian remarks from Anthony Blinken during his most recent trip to Tel Aviv, but they know that they're in trouble with those young voters and trying to do what they can without necessarily changing DC policy to try and get them back on side ahead of November.
All right. Well, Nick Harper joining us live from Washington, D.C. Great to see you and talk to you, Nick. Thank you for all of that.